Good evening, everybody. Dear Mr. Stiglitz, dear Mrs. Schifrin, dear MISHA GLENNY, and dear Desi Gavrilova, and dear audience, your excellencies all over. My name is Veronika Kaup-Hasler. I'm the current Councillor for Arts, Culture and Science of the city of Vienna, and I really have to say especially to Mr. Stiglitz a warm welcome on behalf of the mayor of the city of Vienna, who unfortunately can't be here. It is a great comfort in difficult times to see a full auditorium in a university, a place that is dedicated to debate, free speech and rational thought. I'm also very happy to welcome Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate and one of the most distinguished economists of today. In his research work, Joseph Stiglitz is tackling the question of inequality and social imbalance, one of the most urgent questions of our time. Our societies are constantly drifting apart. Insecurity is growing, and thus political extremism is on the rise. We can observe this trend all over the world recently in neighboring countries of Austria. Look at the elections of Italy, look at Hungary and other countries. These tendencies show that our democracies are not that firm and stable as we all would like them to be. This is why we must continue to talk about the need of fundamental rights, of strong democratic institutions, but also about the need of a free press that really deserves that name. And this is a struggle which is not a struggle only in other countries, it's a struggle we have to fight here too. I would like to add one thought to all this. It is not about simple answers to complex problems. We want to make well-informed decisions that are based on reliable research processes, not onto assumptions or faith or fake news. Therefore, politicians like me have to engage in a constant exchange with the academia, with scholars. It is our basis, and our decisions have to be taken from there. The Vienna Humanities Festival is a great place to do this. And I'm really happy that this program is so wonderfully developed by MISHA GLENNY and Desi Gavrilova, her team from Time to Talk, and MISHA GLENNY, who is now the new rector of Institut für die Wissenschaft von Menschen, IWM. And so I think you're waiting for other words from other people. So a warm welcome to you, MISHA, and I'm looking forward to your speech.
Thank you, Veronika. Thank you very much. Geschätzte Gäste, my dear friends and guests, as you now know, my name is MISHA GLENNY and I am the rector of the Institute for Human Sciences, or IWM, here in Vienna. It's my most sincere pleasure to welcome you to the opening event of this 5th Vienna Humanities Festival, which has been organized by the Institute for Human Sciences and Desi Gavrilova's Time to Talk. This is the first time we've been able to host the festival in 3 years because of the pandemic, and it's the first time that I have been able to preside over it as IWM Rector, a position which I assumed in May this year. Now, we have got a remarkable array of speakers at this year's festival, both from Austria and from further afield. Our next event will be on Friday evening when Daniel Kehlmann, the renowned novelist, dramatist and screenplay writer, will talk about his work and present the only drama which he has written that has never been performed here in Vienna. It will be a rehearsed reading. That takes place around the corner at the Technische Universität. The Sky. On Saturday evening, though, Frau KUPPELSAAL, Veronica, has kindly invited and agreed to host Catherine Belton, author of the best-selling Putin's People, at the Rathaus as a Wiener Vorlesung, which we're all really looking forward to. Over the weekend, we have more superb talks, including the historian Margaret Macmillan, Ron Diebert, who uncovered the scandal of Pegasus spyware, the writer Philip Blom, and the Turkish author and activist Ece Temurkuran. There are too many stellar voices for me to mention here, but I do urge you to look at the program, as I'm confident that there will be many conversations there that you're going to find interesting. So with such great events on the horizon, it is appropriate that we begin with a guest who is acknowledged to be one of the most influential on the planet. An American economist, a professor at Columbia University. He is also the co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD, and the chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. He was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001 and the John Bates Clark Medal in 1979. A former senior vice president and chief economist at the World Bank, and a former chairman of the US Council of Economic Advisors. In 2000, he founded the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, a think tank on international development based at Columbia University in New York. In 2011, he was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Known for his pioneering work on asymmetric information, his research focuses on income distribution, on climate change, corporate governance, public policy, macroeconomics, and globalization. The author of numerous books, including most recently People, Power and Profits, Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy, and of course, Globalization and Its Discontents Revisited. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Joseph Stiglitz.
Can I stay here, or do you want me to go up?
I want you to go up. Sure.
Okay. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and let me echo the words that were already said. This is a time of great uncertainty and a great turmoil, and a time in which our democratic values are under attack. And that's why it's particularly meaningful for me to be in a place where you can have this kind of democratic discussion and as you said, in terms of a rational approach to some of the most difficult problems that the world is facing. I've long argued that the economic inequalities, the economic divides, have played an important role in creating an environment which provides a fertile field for demagogues to take advantage, and has been, when I wrote my book, The Price of Inequality, one of the things I argued was that one of the prices we pay for the level of inequality was that it risked the creation of demagogues for whom there are a large supply, and they would take advantage of that inequality to prey on those who have not done as well. And unfortunately, when I wrote that book, I didn't have in mind any particular individual. I knew that there was an ample supply, and in America we had one particular person who more than filled the shoes of a demagogue. But that has had global impact, and there are others today that are also around the world, with more than half the world today in regimes that are authoritarian. It is something that we need to worry about a great deal. Most of my time during my talk, I'm going to discuss some of the more mundane economic issues that face the world today in the kind of uncertainty and turmoil that we're in. I'm going to talk about the war, what I think Europe and the United States should have done and should be doing about that war. I'm going to talk about a really mundane topic, inflation, but I guess as an economist, people expect me to talk about inflation, and I have strong views. And I'm going to go on from there to talk about, very briefly, the new global economic and geopolitical order. Talk a little bit about the neoliberal economics, and then I'm going to try to conclude with my view of an alternative vision towards which our societies ought to be moving. Let me begin with the war. This war of aggression by Russia, by Putin, against Ukraine. It's a violation of international law, and I found it very heartening, the resolution that Europe has made to fight this, and the United States and the other advanced countries. But I'm disappointed in a couple ways. The first is, while it's a war, and clearly Putin has recognized it as a war, as he's mobilized, what he calls partial mobilization, Europe hasn't, and the United States hasn't really responded, and didn't respond in the beginning, recognizing that it was a war in which our interest as democracies, our interest in the international rule of law had so much at stake. What different, if we had recognized that it was a war, how would we have done things differently? Well, there are two things that I would emphasize. First, the economy of peacetime is not well suited for the economy of war. When we went to war in World War II, we didn't say we're just going to go on as if everything was normal. We recognized that we had to take over the car factories and tell them they had to manufacture tanks. We realized that markets do not work well when time is at stake. And in war, time is really important. You can't say, oh, well, it'll take 2 or 3 years to adjust. Meanwhile, you'll lose the war. Market economics has permeated every aspect of our society, but no general fights a war by saying, let's use the price system within the military. No company, very few companies, use the price system within their company. And there are good reasons. I don't have time to explain why, but they reflect the limits of the market and the limits of prices. And unfortunately, this is a lesson that on both sides of the Atlantic, it's been hard for people to grasp. Before this war of Russian aggression against Ukraine, we were fighting another war. It was against a pathogen, COVID-19. And interestingly, in that particular war, the United States did recognize that it could not rely on markets. We were lucky to have a law that had been passed years before with no idea that we would be fighting a pandemic, called the Defense Production Act, DPA, which gave the government, in the context of a war, the power to order firms to produce certain things. Except you don't have to rely on market mechanisms when there's a war going on. And we interpreted the war against COVID-19 as a war, and this was true even of a Republican administration. And so we commandeered, we told companies that they had to make ventilators. Other countries were even more forceful in using war powers, ordering firms to produce masks and protective gear, so they didn't have the kind of shortage and tests that didn't have the shortages that the United States faced. Well, how does this apply to this particular war, the war against Russia? Well, there's been a history of, over the last 40 years, of fighting wars and not talking about it. The United States, I think, hasn't declared a war since World War II. We went to war in Korea, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, but never declared it. The last wars, we tried to pretend that they weren't really wars. And it was easy for us to do this because we used mercenaries. We called them enlisted people, poor people for whom serving in the military was their best opportunity to get ahead. Most of them were patriots, but there were more, it was the only opportunities that they had. But most Americans didn't have to face war. We could, and Russia has tried the same thing and found it difficult. And that's why there's been an attempt not to recognize that this is a war, but a lot is at stake. So the first thing, at the very beginning of the war, people realized we didn't want to make this into a nuclear war, and so we were going to use economic mechanisms, economic sanctions. And the sanctions on exports to Russia have been very effective. A large fraction of their domestic airlines are grounded, making life much more difficult. They can't get ships that they need for advanced equipment. So our exports to Russia have been actually very effective and will be more effective over time. But it should have been clear that trying the sanctions against Russian exports presented a problem because their exports were oil and gas, and Europe was very dependent, particularly on gas from Russia. In one of my earlier books, not on sale here, but one worth reading, is called Making Globalization Work, and it was published in 2006, written earlier, obviously, and I had a section in the book where I talked about the failures of markets and the failures of globalization and how markets were very short-sighted. And a particular example that I expanded on was how Germany, and I didn't mention Austria, but had become very dependent on Russian gas. And it was so obvious, having dealt with Yeltsin and then seeing Putin, that Russia was not a reliable trade partner. I would not want to put all my money into that basket. And I said it was really an exemplification of the short-sightedness of markets and governments that they had become so reliant on Russian gas. And it was very clear that this would have not only economic consequences, but political consequences, which are being felt today. But recognizing that the imposition of sanctions, if they were going to be effective, would mean that price of energy would go up, meant that Europe, in March, as soon as it was clear that Ukraine was offering kind of resistance, should have said, we need to do everything we can quickly to provide more energy, and this should have been a global effort. And so there should have been a massive attempt to produce green energy. They should have used war power acts to produce solar and wind, and you could have done a lot more. Some was done, but a lot more could have been done. And it should have been a global effort, because remember, if you, wherever you produce this global energy, renewable energy, it reduces the demand for oil and gas, and that alleviates the power, the effect of the sanctions. As it is, as you know, that the price of oil went up so much that actually the sanctions enriched the coffers of Putin, and they were, for a moment, counterproductive. Now the prices come down, and the sanctions, even on exports, will begin to bite even more. There's a second way in which, if this were recognized to be a war, there would have been a response. When countries go to war, they recognize that there will be shortages, as I just mentioned in the case, and the market mechanisms won't work in the same way. Europe, in the structure of its electricity system, unfortunately came under too much influence of what I've sometimes called neoliberalism, free market ideology. They deregulated in a way that standard recipe in the 80s, that's 40 years ago, and they made the price of electricity dependent on the highest cost source of energy, which turned out, as the gas prices went up, turned out to be gas. That form of deregulation we had tried in the United States and California. Most of you are too young to remember what happened, but it was a disaster. We wound up with shortages, prices were spiking. There were a lot of debate about what was the problem. The people on the right said, oh, it's because of all the environmentalists that won't allow dirty coal to be used for electricity generation. All kinds of stories were put what was going on. Well, we found out what was going on. It was deregulation didn't work, and deregulation made the electricity market subject to manipulation. Enron, I don't know if you remember Enron, was the culprit. It got its comeuppance. It wound up in bankruptcy. So that was the good news about it, and the head of Enron wound up in jail. California learned the lesson. It re-regulated, and the interesting thing is all those shortages, all those stories, excuses about why there were these shortages, all the shortages disappeared once you had a well-regulated electricity market. And there's an important lesson here. The average cost of electricity hasn't gone up that much. It's gone up a little bit. I mean, gas is more expensive, oil is more expensive. But the marginal cost has gone up a lot. And the marginal cost gets reflected in electricity. All prices have allocative effects and distribution effects, and they have to be balanced. But the allocative effects in the context of what is going on are minimal. The reason is high prices are supposed to generate more production. But if people think the high prices are not going to be permanent, and hopefully the war is not permanent, then they won't generate any increasing supply. And many of the savings on the demand side are also long-term. You have to invest in insulation, you have to do... So if you had a long-term strategy saying we are committed to making sure that there's more insulation, more green energy, then there will be a supply response. But leaving to the market doesn't do any of that. Leaving to the market says this is a temporary aberration that'll go away, and so nobody, the incentives for demand and supply responses are very limited. And they have been very limited. There are ways of getting the incentives right without the huge distribution consequences. And they're pretty obvious. If you say to a household or a firm, if you consume 80, 90% of what you did last year, there won't be, you'll pay the same price. But if you consume more than that, you'll have to pay a higher price. That provides an incentive for people to conserve without imposing the huge distribution consequences. Think of what is going on in Norway, a country which is a net energy exporter. Much of their energy comes from hydroelectric. They have huge gas supplies. And yet, the price of electricity under the framework of the European market has soared 7-10 times. Can you imagine the anger of the people in Norway that they're exporting energy and their electricity prices are soaring? Electricity, you're paying 3%, 4% of your income in energy, in electricity, and suddenly it's gone up to 25% of your income. You can imagine what stress this does to households. And think of a small business. It'll put them over the brink and put them into bankruptcy. It's also having an enormously disruptive effect on the financial markets because people have taken all kinds of positions, derivatives, other positions, which they can't, contracts which they can't fulfill. And so it's sort of like a Lehman moment in the United States. What's happened? Governments have intervened in ways that, last time we saw this in 2008. Germany, you don't think of that as a left-wing country, has nationalized enterprise. Massive, huge subsidies, contrary to the principles of state aid that are integral to a single market. All because Europe did not realize that it was at war, all because it went to war with a flawed framework for electricity regulation that made it very vulnerable to the kinds of shock that it went through. Well, I hope that Europe quickly learns the lesson and changes. But and they've begun to do some things, but it's too little and too late. For instance, they've finally gotten around to having a windfall profits tax. But it's very narrowly defined. It's only on fossil fuels, it exempts traders. Much of what is going on, the profits have to do, the high prices, the huge profits, have to do with electricity traders. They've been exempted. Also the issues of trying to cap the price. It's not clear how effective those will be, and they're only partial initiatives. So the point is, at last, in war, normally, the companies that take advantage of wartime situation, called war profiteering, are executed. Well, I'm not calling for that kind of strong execution yet. But what should be done is that the profits that they didn't earn, it's not like they took actions for which they deserve these high. In fact, it's just the opposite. If the sector, the energy sector, had been more resilient, the prices wouldn't have gone up. Their profits come from not acting in a good way, from failing to invest in resilience. So they're profiting from the sectors profiting from its lack of resilience. And it's not just energy, it's food, it's many other parts of the economy. So as Europe and America go to war, this limited war, we ought to be having windfall profits taxes, with the proceeds used both to respond to the supply shortages and with the revenues used to help those who are suffering so much from the increases in prices. Let me go on to the next topic, which is the new global, which is the inflation that is emerging. And I'll just say a few words about this. Most of the episodes of inflation over the last 4 decades have been related to excess demand. And when there's excess demand, we have a very good instrument. You raise interest rates. That lowers investment, that lowers sometimes the purchases of cars, consumption, and that lowers aggregate demand, and that brings demand and supply into balance, and that dampens the inflation. If they get it right, and they typically don't. But basically, that is the mechanism. But this is different. This is not inflation caused by an excess of aggregate demand. I've already described what is going on, and all of you know it. It's the high price of energy, the high price of food. In the beginning, before the war, we had high car prices. It wasn't because we didn't know how to make cars. We had factories that weren't working. What was the problem? Our auto companies, except for Tesla, forgot to order chips. A little minor detail. But having failed to order the chips, they couldn't get the chips in short order, and that meant you couldn't produce cars, because cars have a lot of chips in them. And that led to an increase in the price of new and used cars. You ask the question, will raising interest rates create more oil or gas? Will it create more food? Will it create more chips that will enable the production of cars to resume? No, it won't solve any of those problems. In fact, it'll make them a little worse, because what we want is some investment to relieve the supply constraints. We want investment in green energy to make more energy available. We spent 40 years, 50 years more telling our farmers not to grow. All we have to do is tell our farmers to grow, and we would have more food. So there's no intrinsic shortage of food. It's just our public policy about agriculture. Some of the constraints, like that of chips, will probably be resolved on their own within the next few months. Now, it is true that some of us thought that the supply interruptions were more temporary than they proved to be. We didn't fully grasp how dysfunctional the market economy was. we didn't realize how the lack of resilience of the market economy. We should have understood that in a way, because we saw in 2008 the short-sighted nature of the market in the financial markets, particularly in the United States. But as we looked at our economy, we realized that we have been making cars without spare tires, perfectly fine as long as you don't have a flat tire or 100 miles or 200 miles from the nearest gas station. And our whole system of just-in-time inventories was designed for an economy on an even keel, but doesn't work very well when you have a big perturbation, such as the pandemic. So the lesson that emerges is the economy was not as resilient, and some of these supply interruptions are deeper than we had thought in the beginning. But they are still a supply side problem. There is no evidence that aggregate demand is the underlying source of the problem. We've looked at the numbers very carefully. Aggregate demand is actually below trend in the United States. So it is not a question of demand causing inflation, and raising interest rates isn't going to solve the structural demand problems, structural supply problems that are giving rise to it. What it will do is cause an economic downturn. And the problem is that raising interest rates when there's inflation is basically part of the DNA of central bankers. They don't know how to behave any other way. And they're a little bit like medieval bloodletters. It used to be you let the blood when somebody was sick because the belief was that the bad humors were in the blood and that was causing the illness. And normally, as you let more and more blood, the patient didn't get better, he got worse. And what was the response of the doctors, the bloodletters? Do more of the same. And unless divine intervention happened, and it didn't happen that often, the patient eventually died. Well, that's what our central banks are determined to do. They believe they have to show conviction, resolution. And we could be lucky. The war could end. Weather could get better and we could get more food. Inflation could come down. And actually in the United States for a few months, inflation stopped. But we could also be unlucky. The war could last longer. The COVID-19 could last longer in China. It could continue the lockdowns. There could continue to be supply side problems. And those central bankers, I think, will continue to raise interest rates until there is a high enough unemployment that inflation will be brought down, but at the expense of a deep economic downturn. So I hope that doesn't happen, but it is my fear. Let me turn to the third topic I wanted to touch on, which is the new global order. Even after we emerge from this terrible war, the world will be different. The U.S. has really declared China to be the enemy. In fact, we've been at conferences where especially people from the Republican Party, leaders have been arguing Russia is a distraction. We ought to be focusing our attention on China. There's a certain irony of hearing that language from demagogues on the right criticizing authoritarianism in China. Coming from their voices, it's hardly convincing. But the point I want to make is that, like it or not, and whether it's rational or not, the fact is there is a bipartisan view for different reasons that China does represent a threat, and that is leading to strong pressures for delinkage. And Europe is going to be, and the developing countries are going to be caught in the middle. And it is going to be difficult. One aspect of this new Cold War that is emerging is it's in part a Cold War, a war for the hearts and minds of those in the third world. And unfortunately, we have not been managing that particular war for the hearts and minds of those in the third world very well. In fact, we had a difficult time in the beginning because we have a history of colonialism and oppression and neocolonialism and international institutions that didn't manage things very well. But what we've done over the pandemic has been absolutely terrible. We had vaccine apartheid. And while we had access to vaccines, those in developing countries did not. And when the developing countries, India and South Africa, that had the capacity to produce the vaccines and ask the question, can we use patented intellectual property rights, intellectual property that was produced, paid for overwhelmingly by public authorities in the United States and in Europe? The answer was no. Even though we couldn't produce an adequate supply, the answer was, we won't allow you to produce it. And if you try, we'll sue you, and you'll pay an enormous amount, and no firm was willing to take that risk. And so we put profits over people's lives. Russia managed it a lot better. They gave their Sputnik vaccine. They said they would help countries make that Sputnik vaccine. So and China did the same. So they realized that there was a war for the hearts and mind in the third world. And unfortunately, they've been winning. And it's partly because of our selfishness. Now, some of us persuaded President Biden to support the vaccine waiver that India and South Africa had requested. But Germany, Switzerland, and the UK said no. And that has affected global politics, geopolitics at the moment, a great deal. And it's one of the reasons that today support for the Ukraine in the war of Russian aggression in the third world is remarkably weak. And I think we're paying a high price for that mistake, which was so clear that we would have to pay that kind of price. So very briefly to come to the two final topics, neoliberal economics. I've already hinted some of the criticisms of that, the kind of short-sightedness, the kind of failures of handling the 2008 financial crisis. But anybody looking at where the market economy has gone in recent decades has to be critical. The era of neoliberalism has been marked, which we go back to the era of Reagan and Thatcher, has been marked by slower growth and almost most of that growth has gone to the benefit of those at the top, creating the inequality that has provided the fertile field for the demagogues. But in addition to that, there have been one crisis after another. When we feel that very strongly in the United States, which is sort of the archetype of what we're talking about. We have the opioid crisis, the childhood diabetes crisis, the inequality crisis, the climate crisis. I could go on. Life expectancy in the United States was in decline before the pandemic, from a level that was the lowest of any of the advanced countries. America, the notion of the American dream that anybody can make it from the bottom to the top was a myth. The life prospects of young American were more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in almost any other country. And many in Europe and other countries aspire to the American model. But if they looked at the data, they would have some greater reservations. But the American model is the model of neoliberalism. And it exposes in many ways the flaws. Now, as an economic theorist, much of my work was around the theme about why it was that Adam Smith's notion of invisible hand, the pursuit of self-interest, would lead as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. Why? The reason why it was invisible was it wasn't there. And it did not. The pursuit of self-interest, greed, did not lead to the well-being of society. And we need, for a well-functioning society, public investments. We need good regulations. If we didn't have stoplights, you would have grid. We would have gridlock in our cities. Externalities are pervasive: climate, public health. You need social insurance for societies to function. So that leads me to the final topic. What is the alternative? Well, the alternative is a more balanced perspective in which you have a better balance not only between the private and the public sector, between private action and collective action, but in which you have a whole array of a broad ecology of institutions, not-for-profits, cooperatives. The nature of our institutions actually plays an important role in shaping who we are. And there's now mounting evidence on that. I don't mean to insult any of you who happen to be bankers, but the evidence is that people who in the field, on average, in banking, are more selfish and more dishonest than in other fields. And when they're my students, before they do that, that's not quite true. It is being in that focus on money shapes people. I should also, just to be fair, point out the same is true of economists. That it is true that economics does attract people who are greedier and more selfish. But if you trace them, as the longer they study economics, the greedier and more selfish they become. So we succeed in making our students like the assumptions that we begin our analysis with, which is that everybody is selfish and self-interested and greedy. So we succeed in making them like that, and then we turn around and say everybody we know, who are all economists, are like that. And that confirms our view of life. So the notion of, that I call it progressive capitalism, it could be called social democracy, and democracy is an important component of this, where you put the individual, and the individual embedded in a society at the core of what is going on. It's not that individuals are supposed to serve the economy, but the economy serves our individuals in our society. And I believe, and I try to articulate this in my book, People, Power, and Profits, that this alternative is a way of how in the 21st century we can shape our economy in ways that will create a greater shared prosperity, and looking at prosperity from a broader view, not just of material well-being, but of the well-being of individuals in a broader sense. Thank you.
Joe, thank you so much. Obviously, there's a great deal to chew over as a consequence of that, and we've got about 15 or 20 minutes to do so. Before, I hasten to add, you have kindly agreed to sign books for members of the audience, so that's another treat to look forward to. But let's go straight away to your final point about neoliberalism, and something that continues to puzzle me to this day. So you mentioned its sort of full-throated advent under Thatcher and Reagan. You had this huge surge of speculative capitalism in the 1990s, and after that we started to see a series of crises, whether it was the forever wars, which you wrote about in your book, I think the 6 trillion war book.
5 trillion. 3 trillion.
3 trillion.
It was really, our estimate was 5 trillion, but we thought we didn't want to scare people.
So you just rated it 3.
At 3 trillion.
And that was followed by 2008, the financial crash, and then this, of course, then leading up to Trump, Brexit, and so on and so forth. Had the pandemic, for which we showed very little resilience, despite the fact that governments around the world had studied this problem and knew that it was likely to come, and actually in their bottom drawers had the information to tell them what to do in that event. And now we've had the Russia-Ukrainian war since February, the deepening competition between China and the US. At what point do people more generally say, wait a minute, neoliberalism doesn't appear to be working here. It just seems to deliver a series of crises which make our lives more and more difficult. How do we explain the persistence of neoliberalism in the face of facts which seem to suggest that it clearly doesn't work?
Well, Misha comes from the UK, where that issue is particularly salient, because they've just chosen a government who has doubled down on a failed economic model, and the markets are rewarding them almost instantaneously as the pound reaches new low, bond market interest rates are rising. Even markets which are conservative and right-wing are saying, you've gone too far. And so I understand where that question is coming from. Let me say, in the United States, I think a majority of, and on most issues, a large majority of Americans have rejected neoliberalism. If you go down issue by issue, you will find that they support a doubling of the minimum wage. They believe in public provision of health care, debate about what form, but everybody believes that leaving it to the market is not right. they realize that our education system for university is not functional, and they want something to be done about that. They want strong regulation of the financial sector. 75% think that deregulation of the financial sector was a big mistake. I could go down the list. The point is, if you ask about the doctrines of neoliberalism, they're rejected. At the same time, some of the mantra that Reagan,
I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Exactly, that's what I was thinking of. Are so embedded in our brains that there's a kind of cognitive dissonance. They hear that mantra, and yet they know it's wrong when it comes to specific issues. Let me give you one more example. Everybody criticizes government workers, but then you talk to them about specific government workers. They love the teachers, they love the national parks and the people who work there. Social Security, our old age, they think the people who provide that, it's rated as one of the best companies in the world, whether it's public or private. You go down the list, and actually, they like government workers. So there is, again, this kind of cognitive dissonance. The right has been engaged in a campaign to make people resentful and to make government not work by underfunding it. I mean, the worst example is where the Republicans voted not to have money to enforce the tax laws, so that everybody would think the tax system is unfair because rich people don't pay their fair share of taxes. And they said, well, but we shouldn't enforce it.
So would you then, in that case, characterize the populism in the style of Trump, but the characters all over the world, would you sort of call that the final stage of neoliberalism? I.e., is this a desperate measure by neoliberal ideologues to sustain this system, or does Trump and populists like him, do they represent something different?
I hope it's the last desperate stage. One of the reasons that gives me some confidence in that particular view is that the supporters of that view, combined with the rich who want to maintain low taxes on the rich, together are so committed to undermining our democracy. They know that they cannot win in a fair election, and so they're engaged in voter suppression, gerrymandering, doing everything they can to destroy our democracy.
So we really are involved in a massive struggle to retain our democratic rights in the face of a surge of authoritarianism and populism.
Very much so. It is a power struggle. I think they recognize that they've lost the battle of ideas. The evidence is so strongly against them, and so they have to engage, you might call it, in warfare. One aspect of that warfare, which is going on very clearly in the case of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, is mis and disinformation. And so we're living in a kind of informational dystopia as well.
Mm. So before I go, I'm going to end up with some questions about US and China, and specifically the US. But first of all, I want to go back to what you started with, this paradox that Europe is at war, but it doesn't recognize that it's at war. So if you look at Germany, which is probably the pivotal country in the European Union, which is not to dismiss other EU member states, but obviously the German role is critical. That is a society that is divided on the issue of the war. The majority of Germans support the idea of supplying military aid to Ukraine and so on, but there is a very powerful and influential lobby in Germany, primarily industry, not just energy, but obviously including energy, which is saying quite openly at the moment, this is not our war. If we continue to support the Ukrainians or increase that support, Germans are going to be cold over the winter, industry is going to close down. How do you, when the impact of the war is not obvious to people in the countries, if you walk around Vienna, the good burghers don't really see themselves as being involved in a war at the moment. How do you convince people that this is a war? And particularly those vested interests in business and industry.
Well, I think one has to be very clear about what the stakes are. And the most important stake, obviously, is the international rule of law. You know, if one country can march into another, where are we? You know, and that was why the UN was created in 1944. And this has been, you know, there haven't been very many instances of the violation of this. You know, Iraq attacked Kuwait, and the UN responded. But there's been no major violation of that principle. And it seems to me that once that principle goes, we're back into a very, very different world. And I don't think it's a world that any of us want to be in. So I think convincing people that this war of aggression is really important for the international rule of law, if you want to think of it, is crucial. It's the most important. It's far more important than trade law or any other aspect of international law. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, you know, there's some debate about how much one wants to talk about it, but it is, Putin represents the worst of authoritarianism. And do you want to lose your democracy? And a victory there is a victory for authoritarianism. And the third thing is a little bit more difficult for your those focused on their short-run profits, but a little bit of empathy, realizing that if Ukraine goes, it's going to be Moldova, Georgia, it's going to be the whole frontier of all the countries, certainly all the countries that are not members of NATO, and possibly, eventually then, a threat to NATO countries themselves. So empathy would say, you know, what if I were living in one of those countries, would I want somebody to come to my assistance? And I think the answer is very strongly yes.
Couple more questions, moving to a sort of broader stage again. You've been one of the most incisive critics of the negative aspects of globalization, and notably how it's promoted inequality within and between states. We've been seeing the fragmentation and the collapse of globalizing phenomena over the past decade or so. Which of those aspects of globalization should we retain, and which of them should we jettison?
Well, I think first of all, there are large areas where we will need global cooperation. And one of the things I've argued is that one of the failings is we didn't focus as much as we should on the areas where we needed cooperation, and we did too much in areas of special interest, of corporate interest, financial interest. So we need global cooperation in dealing with global public goods, what we call global public goods, climate change, global public health, dealing with a pandemic. There are a whole host of other global environmental issues, the oceans, Antarctica. So there are a whole host of areas where we really need global cooperation, and creating institutions, multilateral institutions, to facilitate that global cooperation is really, I think, very important.
But given what we've been seeing, of course, is the collapse or the steady reduction in influence of multilateral organizations. So bringing it down to the other thing you mentioned, which was the increased competition between China and the US. How do we create that planetary strategy, the global cooperation, when the US and China appear to are decoupling or delinking, as you say? Surely this has to be a process that needs to be reversed. But can you do that when it's at the very front line of that apparent struggle between sort of vaguely, principally democratic countries and principally authoritarian countries?
Yeah, I think we need both sides. I think do realize, or at least should realize, that we have a common interest in saving the planet. There's a little bit of a metaphor. If you were in a rowboat, the Titanic is sinking, and you may be in that rowboat with some people you don't like, but that doesn't mean you're going to overturn the rowboat because you don't like them. You're going to have to learn how to row together until you get to shore. So, we don't have to party together. We don't have to say, we really like what you're doing in the Uyghurs. But we can say, we all have to row together to keep the planet going. And I can tell you, China really does have an interest because they're suffering so much from pollution. We should have an interest. Everybody has been suffering from these climate change. So I think that's an area where there is common interest. If we don't have to accuse each other of who's to blame. We know that the advanced countries did most of the pollution before 2010, and the developing countries are doing most of the pollution now. So we can get over that. Just those are facts. But where we are today is we have to address the issue of climate change. And the same thing goes to a pandemic. I think this fight of who's to blame, the fact is we're going to have more pandemics. We know that they're going to occur. That we've been warned of it. And hopefully the next time we have a pandemic, we can cooperate better to make sure that whoever develops first to develop the vaccine together, and make sure that as soon as it's developed, it's distributed and available to everybody.
And finally, can you give the audience here tonight any sense of optimism about the midterm elections in November in the US and then possibly even 2024 presidential?
Yeah, I'll give a little optimism. Maybe I should begin by a note of pessimism. I think things are very dire, and the reason I would mention this to a European audience is not so you can just commiserate with us in our suffering, but because I think there's an important warning here that unfortunately United States is not a reliable partner, and you have to have your own defense forces. I know Austria is neutral and you can't have your but the EU as a whole has to have its own defense forces. It cannot rely on the United States and on NATO. I think that is something that is an important anybody looking at American politics, I think, has to come to that conclusion. Now, you know, and many people who are quite into the politics, including, you know, former presidents, have come to the assessment that there is a 50-50 chance that American democracy may not survive. So it is a gloomy picture. Now, the optimism. I think there are two sources, at least two sources of optimism. One longer term and one short term. Let me give the longer term. And that's the young people. Overwhelmingly, I described how Americans as a whole have rejected neoliberalism when you look at the individual policies. If you look at younger people, it's even stronger in rejecting. They understand climate change. They understand, they're on my side. And so they understand a lot, all these issues. So the real issue in my mind is, can we keep our democracy alive until they get in control? That is the question. Can we keep our planet alive, and can we keep our democracy alive long enough so that the young people, who I think understand a lot of these issues, get more of the control of what is going on? Now, I think that the Republicans have overreached. Ideology was so strong that the Supreme Court has made an incredible set of decisions that are so counter to most Americans' beliefs. A few years ago, they said that there should be no restraint of money in American politics. And people didn't like that. This most recent decision about
Roe versus
Wade. But there are a host of other decisions that have been really emblematic, that they are out of tune with 21st century America, or 21st century world. So I think that has energized enough Americans. That's my hope. And at the same time, Trump has intervened in the Republican Party, and the Republican Party has become a cult. With some 70-80% of the Republican Party believing that the election was stolen, even though court after court, every examination says it's not true. So the Republican Party has moved into an extremist position, and hopefully enough people at the center see what is going on, and that when 2022 midterm elections come and 2024 presidential election comes along, they'll vote to keep American democracy alive.
Well, Joe, I'm sure as long as you're writing about it and explaining the world to Americans and to us in Europe and elsewhere around the world, then we can stay on the side of optimism rather than pessimism. I certainly hope so. But thank you very much for coming here to talk to us. It's been absolutely terrific listening to you, and I'm sure people are looking forward to having their books signed. Thank you so much, Joe.